Thank you. Good morning, guys. Before I dive into this, is anyone here a security person? Anyone in the room actually? We've got one. Anyone else? Awesome. But no, that's good, right? So you guys are exactly the audience that is relevant for this kind of a conversation. And the reason is, why are we talking about security at a machine learning and deep learning conference? And we had a great introduction because I think the thing that everyone knows is, look, this affects all of us. Now, I don't know how late you guys were out last night, but about 10 o'clock I was doing LinkedIn and Twitter because it's what you do. And I saw that the IRS posted that they had just had 100,000 records stolen, right? So people are jumping on the IRS site, they're using it to steal information, and then they're pushing this data out to whatever criminal syndicate is going to now take it and resell it or use it for identity theft. And look, we've seen that with Target. We've seen it with, that's the Care First logo, which was breached last Wednesday. They're actually breached a year ago. Didn't realize it, and then found, hey, we got it wrong. We had another big security problem. Home Depot, the list goes on. And so something's wrong, right? So whether it's because you're seeing it on CNN right before you get on the airplane or because your tax information gets stolen, we're not solving the security problem correctly. And there's a reason for that, and there's actually three. And we're going to get into that a little bit and talk about why it's really well suited to machine learning and deep learning, and that this market, this opportunity, needs the kind of expertise that you guys all bring to bear. And that's very much where I want to take this discussion. But before we do it, so I've only got one security guy in the room, so you don't get to answer. Does anyone else know what this is? Anyone recognize this report? Okay, so this is APT1. This came out from the security firm Mandiant in 2013 in February. And this was really a turning point for the industry. What Mandiant did was they looked at a group of Chinese hackers who were working for the government, who were breaking into EU and US businesses. And what's interesting about APT1 is that this is a moment in time in which we realize something has shifted and changed about security. So I've been doing this since the 90s at a whole bunch of different companies. And for a long time, we thought, really good firewalls. That'll take care of it. We'll just keep everybody out. And the world kind of moves on, and suddenly you don't have a network to protect anymore. Okay, great, we'll have really good antivirus. Not good enough. So we start to see that there are these attacks that are now being sponsored by governments with huge amounts of resource and money behind them that are penetrating networks that are working in multilateral, multidimensional ways to get into corporate and government networks. And so APT1, one, put Mandiant on the map, and two, outlined how this kind of an attack works and gave people this idea that, oh, there's something that we have to think about differently about security. And so we think there are three fundamental unsolved problems that are relevant to this audience, that are relevant to why machine learning is the right approach. And the first one is something that was mentioned a minute ago. We have modern infrastructure, which is much more complicated than the kinds of IT infrastructure we used to protect, right? So maybe this one will get a nod or a hand. Anyone here know what Docker is? Anyone use Docker? All right, there we go. So just this morning, an ex-colleague of mine, a guy named Chris Weisapol, who's the founder of a company called Veracode, posted that his company had done some looking and research into Docker images on the public Docker image repository. About 300 of them have major security vulnerabilities in the images, right? So you have these Docker images, and if anyone doesn't know, Docker is essentially like a virtualization tool for applications. It lets you bundle up an app and deploy it anywhere. This kind of infrastructure, which moves really, really quickly, it's highly automated, rife with problems. Couple that with the cloud. Couple that with Amazon Web Services and configuration management tools that let you spin up and then destroy servers in real time. We have this kind of a risk set, that this threat surface that's ephemeral, that's fast-moving, super difficult for an information security professional to keep up with. Two, we've just accumulated a bunch of technical debt. That image is a little washed out here, but to give you an idea what that is a real network drop from a tool called Snort, which is an intrusion detection system. So there are information security professionals who are going to get that and be told, hey, go figure this out. This is your threat surface. It's about as effective as you'd imagine. I think those red things are vulnerabilities. We don't know what to do with this. And the third and sort of most important problem, there's a 1.5 million person shortfall in the information security analyst space right now. There just aren't enough people to deal with this data. So think to yesterday when we were hearing about how Twitter's doing some work around taking what were once manually solved problems and trying to automate it away and apply it to this problem domain. You have incredibly complicated infrastructure that's moving very quickly We have tools, expert systems that are good at little pieces of it, but we've built this patchwork of problems, and we don't have enough people to continue to manually deal with this. And oh yeah, we have increasingly sophisticated attacks that use what we call now advanced persistent threat techniques. So we have our ubiquitous hacker image, which seems to be famous. I don't know who that actor is. That guy's on every hacking or cybersecurity presentation in the world now. But APT is basically what the APT-1 report put into the public lexicon, which is this idea that you don't just have one guy in his basement hacking into your systems anymore. It's not even one guy on the plane doing it. They're, to the IRS's point from last night's revelation, incredibly sophisticated criminal syndicates that build logistics infrastructure that puts most companies to shame. Hundreds and hundreds of servers, thousands of people around the world sharing information and working together to penetrate networks. And so we have this under-the-radar attack problem, and it's very difficult for any one person or even any one organization to start to solve it. But where it's difficult for a person, it becomes easier for a machine. So if we distill down that attack anatomy, if we start thinking about APT, we can play out that this is essentially about understanding what you're going to do when you want to launch a cybersecurity attack, creating some kind of malware, some infrastructure, some way of getting in. But 96% of the time, what that means is you get spearphished. We've probably all seen it in our personal lives. You get the email from PayPal, and suddenly it's a 4 instead of the A, and you're supposed to go click on this link, and oh yeah, let me just verify my bank information and my social security number, my date of birth, and everything else. Yeah, well that happens for companies too. And that weaponized malware then gets used to establish what we call command and control channels, hands-on keyboard access for whomever the attacker is, where they can move around and eventually get sensitive data and steal it. And then they go sell it, or they use it for identity theft. If we think about those as essentially parameters in a series of linear analysis algorithms, we can start to do some very early machine learning around what we see inside an organization, how we can plot outliers, things that do or don't make sense in terms of what's normal versus what might represent an attack. So for a little while now, the security industry has started to think about this. We're starting to do some really basic regression analysis, some really basic forms of graphing of, okay, I see that you typically log in between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., but if you get a weird email and then a week later you're logging in at 2 a.m. and you're hitting the servers that you never hit, maybe something's wrong. But that's really basic, right? So what we're starting to look for are ways that we can blow this out into a more complete deep learning process. So the next iteration of this is looking at a way that we can start to replace 80 to 90% of the manual work that information security analysts have done historically with a series of algorithms, some of which are supervised and some of which are not, that can take all of this data for an organization. Think about login logs. When does somebody access your environment? Authorization. What apps are running? What are they able to do inside a network? And think about what those people are doing when they sit down in their security operations center and start looking at this data and say, oh, that's strange, that's not strange. Well, what you get is the beginning of a supervised learning algorithm that if you can present that to someone in a way that they can actually pick it up and deal with it, you can see whether or not you've got a false positive or a false negative. You can start to see whether or not there are indicators of compromise. Couple that with some predictive analytics. Couple that with a model by which you can say, we look for these IOCs, indicators of compromise, and then forecast. If your Anthem got breached, they're a subsidiary of Blue Cross Blue Shield, about a week ago, and you start seeing that there are people attacking your network, it's pretty reasonable that Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, that Tufts Healthcare, that all of the other HMOs should be aware of what those indicators of compromise are and pay attention and look for them inside their environment. And if we see them, the algorithm can get smarter because we can start to say, it's accurate that when somebody attacks a network in one particular way, they will begin attacking other networks along the same lines. And over time, we can start to look at the results of that and say, well, what if I blocked certain ports? What if I blocked IP addresses? What if I looked for certain insider threats and mechanisms of action by which people move around inside the network? There's a guy named John Kindervag who is an analyst for Forrester Research, and John wrote a few years ago about a new model for thinking about software networks called Zero Trust. Very few people have done it well, but one of the things that Zero Trust says is that you limit the privileges that any individual account should have, right? So if we look at Anthem, or let's go with the one that you guys know, Target. Everyone knows that there was a big Target breach. Target got penetrated, they got hacked because The HVAC guys had their accounts compromised. The HVAC guys should never have been able to get into Target's payment network, right? So this is where we start looking at this result-driven approach. Well, what if we start limiting and putting in place better zero-trust networking principles, and then looking at the supervised and unsupervised learning models to tell when you are or not doing that? Start to restrict where this access comes in. And in aggregate, where this goes, where the future of this is the beginnings from someone, somewhere, of a neural network for understanding what's happening in the security industry. If we're not going to have enough people to solve this problem manually, then what we need to start to put together is some kind of a multidimensional security analysis framework that can take not just what's happening for one company, or not just what's happening for one tool that somebody buys, but all the companies in an industry, all of the different organizations that exist inside of, say, the retail space, the healthcare space, and look for those indicators of compromise, look for those mechanisms of action that are allowing people to begin to move laterally inside the network, and run them through a learning module, some kind of a neural network that can look for what does and doesn't actually happen, and have an outcome that very simply becomes just a binary distribution. This was or was not an attack. Now, we're not saying, and I don't think it's reasonable to assume that we're going to take the job of the information security analyst, a highly expert-driven, knowledge-driven role, and make it totally automated. But the typical InfoSec analyst today gets about 150,000 alerts in front of them on their dashboard. They can do some things with tools like Splunk, which I'm sure some of you folks are using, or the competitors to Splunk, but they don't have a mechanism for really understanding what's going on. So let's break down that problem. Let's decompose it into a set of narratives that they can look at and say, well, on the one hand, this might be an attack, and I can see that there are maybe 50% of those 150,000 alerts that constitute that attack. And on the other hand, maybe it's not, and we can just acknowledge that we got it right. Let's start thinking about how cybersecurity fails and how we can start to learn from those failures to improve our defenses. So that is very much what we're looking at and talking about now. So I think we'll open this up for questions in just a minute, but because there's only one security person in the room, I'm kind of interested, especially as we go through this conversation, to talk a little bit more about where the security industry might learn from what you're all working on and how machine learning, deep learning, can improve this outcome so we're not sitting on planes and worrying that the guy next to us might have accidentally or intentionally gotten into the engine system when he was trying to do something. So that's very much what we're working on at GreatHorn, but it's the beginnings of a market. And this is the sort of environment and the group that we think is going to be additive as we start to understand how to fix this problem. And it's a big one that hits all of us.